Hello everyone. So I'm possibly choosing the worst time of day to film a video, but it is commuter hour right now, rush hour, and I live near a busy road, so hopefully the traffic isn't going to annoy you as much as it annoys me. But welcome to another handsy video. Basically I wanted to take a stab at making my own tarot tag. And I'm going to name this something along the lines of like hashtag pacing the tarot or something like that. I'll put the official tag like on the screen here. But effectively I wanted to make this because I have been noticing, obviously in an ongoing fashion, that the discussion around deck acquisition is obviously still going on, and it includes questions like what, if any, is the difference between deck acquisition and deck use. There have been discussions around numbers of decks in a person's collection. There has been the discussion around the purpose of collecting. Are you using your decks? Are you just a collector? What types of readings do you prefer to do? How often? Do you have a cyclical nature to your readings? And then there's also, of course, the discussion around numbers of decks and how that applies to whether or not you read professionally or in some capacity for others versus just for yourself. But what I don't see discussed as much are the, shall we say, ecological aspects of deck collection, particularly around ordering decks for shipping. I have to say I often wonder about deck shipping versus deck returns. What do we mean when we say we cull decks? You know, if we're getting rid of a bunch, obviously a lot of those, I think the understanding is that they go either to charity shops or to friends and family, or they're, you know, put up on some version of Facebook Marketplace or something along those lines. And obviously there's a lot of deck swapping and trading going on, so that minimal waste happens in that regard. But I do have to wonder about services like Amazon, and other such shipping services and companies, and the rate of production and all of those sorts of things, and the ways in which that also impacts not just the planet, but also our mental well-being and our sense of satisfaction in the decks that we clearly adore so much. So this tag is not going to be about how many decks you have, because I genuinely don't think that that's actually relevant to this exercise. There is no judgment about how many decks you have, your rate of acquisition, or anything. The entire purpose of this tag is intended to just have some fun asking some questions and seeing the many different types of answers that people come up with for this, because I am curious. And obviously a diversity of answers is very much encouraged, because that's kind of the point, as I think you'll see. So, pacing the tarot, or something along those lines, whatever I end up calling it. The idea here is that I also wanted people who have admittedly fewer decks in their collection to be able to participate in a tag, and, you know, just sort of benefit from the community aspect in that regard if they so wish. I do think that tags work, especially doing multiple tags, works better if you have many decks, because, you know, kind of by definition, you're less likely to show the same 5, 7, 10 decks over and over again. But again, I'm not here to have a judgment-based conversation around that. I just wanted this tag to be as inclusive as possible. Okay, so the idea here is to show 3 decks, up to 3 decks. If you have fewer than 3 decks, that is not a problem. If you have fewer than 3 decks that fit these sort of designations, not a problem. Up to 3 decks. If you have like 500, 1,000, 3,000 decks, still just go with 3. That's the main idea here, okay? And there are 3 prompts or categories, and this does not need to be a definitive list. So it's not that kind of fun pressure that you get around top 5, top 10, where there's like a real sort of honing and narrowing down happening. This is more intended as a fun way to explore some examples of these phenomena in your deck collections or your possessions as related to tarot and cartomancy. So if you so wish, this can include Oracle. I will just be covering tarot in this video. The first category, actually I should state, each category is going to include basically 2 sub-questions. one of them being why, like why is that? Why have you chosen the one you've chosen, and what about it causes it to be in that category for you? And the other being some various iterations of what can be done about that. But I think that'll become more clear as I actually mention the categories. So the first prompt is your least used deck. Now again, if you have lots of decks that are kind of vying for the top spot in terms of least used, it doesn't matter. Just pick one. It really doesn't matter. If you have only one deck and therefore this is a moot question, you know, maybe find a way to answer this question if you so choose. But again, no pressure. The second category is kind of a combination of like an oldie but a goodie, and or the deck that's had its 15 minutes of fame but seems not to be circulating quite so much anymore. And the third category is a reassess deck, a deck that is causing you to reassess it and its place in your life, and maybe it's rejigging a little bit some of the things you thought were part of your tastes or whatever, and as such it has felt a little bit stuck, or it still feels stuck, or in some way or other it's causing you to kind of just plop a big old question mark on it. Okay, so by way of obviously doing the tag myself, I will show you my choices for this. I will note that my collection currently is hovering around I think 33 decks, including one that has yet to get here. And that's another thing that I will sort of specify as part of this tag, is that obviously I suppose there's no hard and fast rules in this regard, but it kind of defeats the purpose of the tag if you use really recent purchases. So the aim here is to kind of dig into your collection as it exists and find the buried treasure that has kind of gone overlooked, or as of yet relatively unexplored, and so on, underappreciated, etc., etc. So my selection for least used deck is La Corte de Tarocchi. This is an Il Meneghello deck. It is absolutely beautiful. I always have it displayed on my shelf right where I can see it, so it's actually never out of sight. But it is by far one of my least used decks. Now, the first component of this is, why is that? Fundamentally, for this deck, it's actually to do not even with the card shape, but rather the card stock. Plopped in here, kind of funny, isn't it? There we go. So for this one, this is a very, very high quality cardboard kind of paper cardstock, and if one is prone to riffle shuffling, it will not take a bend. And if one is a little bit clumsy, it takes damage really, really quickly in the way that, you know, shuffling just straight up cardboard kind of would. So that's my why, like my fundamental why. It's actually a really, really basic one. This is a pip deck, but it's sort of got a different arrangement. I think partially due to the formatting, but it's a very sort of medieval, I almost want to say sort of fresco style aesthetic, and I love the sort of muted colorations. It's one of the things that I really love in a deck. But effectively, I've been struggling to make myself use it because I get quite nervous. It's not even so much that cardstock usually is something that will totally prevent me from using a deck, because I usually insist on not caring. Or I usually insist on finding a workaround, but this one, I admit, makes me feel some aspects of anxiety at times. So the second part of this entry into this category is, what can I do, what might I do, or what would I, off the top of my mind, think I could do to make sure I get some more use out of this deck? Or if use isn't necessarily my goal, or a person, you know, your goal in that regard, what is some way that you can ensure that, to whatever degree use or circulation or your focus on your decks works, how you might increase that and sort of increase the personal significance of the deck to you or in your practice, and so on. So in my case, use is the main goal. What are some of the ways, what are the strengths of this deck, and what are some of the ways that I might be able to use it more? First of all, one of the things that I have been doing, especially as a clumsy person, it's actually going to be quite hard to show on this camera, I have been practicing shuffling like this. Again, very difficult to show here on the camera. It's actually, I'm getting better at it. But one of the issues that I find with most of my decks is that, especially with this one where it's quite wide and my hands are extremely small, grabbing the decks the long way, not only, as I've indicated before, damages the edges of the cards in this fashion, where there's more surface area to kind of collide, but additionally, as I'm, overhand shuffling and I'm starting to have fewer cards in my hands, once I get down to a few cards, I often accidentally push too hard with my hands and the cards will actually buckle and crease. I've had that happen once or twice with this deck, although thankfully to comparatively minimal damage. But I was very quickly able to see that with a combination of hitting the cards at an angle and overextending my hands to be able to grab the deck, I was basically really struggling to use this deck without first inducing certain levels of, shuffling anxiety, which admittedly is not exactly conducive to doing a reading. So I'm struggling to show you what I'm talking about here as I have a camera in front of me. But the idea being that what I've been doing with actually a lot of my decks, but particularly these larger ones, is practicing, like not even necessarily doing readings, just getting the decks out and practicing shuffling the long, like overhand, but the long way, which is not normally something that's so accessible to the types of movements that my hands sort of are naturally capable of. But since those are my limitations, and the deck, I purchased the deck and it's not the deck's fault, those are my limitations, I'm using that as an opportunity to sort of see what can be done around that and to kind of practice being slightly more flexible in my thinking according to my own sort of baseline tendencies. So that's category number 1, La Corte de Tarocchi by Il Meneghello. Category number 2, an oldie but a goodie, or a deck that's kind of quote unquote had its 15 minutes of fame. This is the bag I made myself. This is my, it's the mezzanine edition of this, or the mezzanine printing, shall we say, print run of the, and it was recalled, of the second edition of the Mary L. Tarot. Now, it's interesting, the original first edition of the Mary L. was released in 2012, and this isn't even obviously the first edition, and it's interesting to me that what qualifies as an oldie but a goodie, and I think a lot of people will come up with different answers for that, and I think that'll be part of what makes this tag, hopefully potentially quite interesting, is to see, is there a consensus view on what an older deck is, who has what perspective and why, and just sort of having fun exploring that. But so the first edition was 2012. This is that weird edition, weird version of the second edition, which I think came out in, I can't remember now. I'll put the year on the screen, but it's compared a little bit more recent. But at any rate, this is the oldie but a goodie. Now, why is it in this sort of Pacing the Tarot tag? This deck, I don't think lacks for appreciation in the tarot community, but I have definitely seen at least in terms of what I have been exposed to online, which is admittedly not always the most current, I have seen a drop off in its mentionings. And I think what's interesting about this is that it's one of my older purchases. It's one of my earlier purchases. Certainly in terms of deeper decks that sort of explore their own system. So my why for including it in this category, the oldie but a goodie, sort of a where are you now kind of phenomenon, is that it's one of the decks that early on, or comparatively early on, introduced me to the fact that I love decks that are effectively their own system, or that do a really interesting amalgamation of systems. Furthermore, I think part of the reason this deck gets covered a little bit less these days is in the plethora of decks being produced, this deck really requires that you take your time and learn it. It's got a lot of its, the guidebook is obviously really, really deep and massive. My understanding is that some people find the approach to some of the esoteric symbolism in this a little bit wonky or different, but the impression I get is that in terms of Marie White's creation of the deck, that may have been intentional. But as far as I'm aware, I think she created this deck from between 1998 2008 and 2009, so like 11 years of painting these images and building this symbolism. A deck like that versus, say, a novelty deck being released by Disney as a franchise, or some other similarly quickly produced, say, RWS-based deck. The difference between, again, I'm trying to kind of refrain from judgment-based language, but the difference between them is that this deck, in taking so long to be considered and built as a system, I think equally deserves and kind of requires a slower approach and an occasional putting down and then a revisiting, at least from my perspective. It's a deck that you grow with it grows with you. It challenges you. I know a lot of people have talked about this as an excellent shadow work deck. I think it's also a deck that pushes us in a better direction in terms of more inclusive thinking, although obviously any given deck or system can always stand to improve. So given the fact that I think it definitely came about as part of that initial wave of indie deck creation, I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting to sort of see over time what niche or sort of place in the tarot world this deck continues to occupy or not, possibly, I don't know. But therefore, this oldie but a goodie category is the why that I've included this is all of the above, all of that stuff. That it's actually really, really interesting to think about not only the complexity of a tarot system that's presented in front of you, but also what that means in terms of the sort of space it occupies in the tarot world, especially, again, over time, sort of seeing how that turns out. Now, what I can do to make sure I use this a bit more, because I have noticed a bit of a drop-off in my use of it, is to focus on that notion that it is in between systems. One of the things that I have noticed about my collection over time, but also in a way that is currently very much increasing, so, in keeping with the development of my tastes, is that what I appreciate is a deck that has certain recognizable anchor points, maybe they RWS or some other form of system, pip decks, whatever it is, recognizable anchor points, but then does something very creative about it or with it. So some very new examples of that would be, say, the Ritual Tarot by Tierra May being a combination of systems, but, certain cards very recognizably RWS, but clearly taking a very different, very intensely creative spin on it, and therefore introducing a lot of new, shall we say, visual or spiritual or esoteric vocabulary into the process of reading tarot. So that's the sort of thing that I've noticed is starting to pique my interest more and more and more and more as time goes on. And therefore, revisiting some of the decks that I got early on that either were instrumental in starting that process or that I haven't incidentally looked at in a while, and then I realize actually suit that process quite well, is one of the ways in which I would definitely make sure to focus topically in terms of bringing this deck a bit into slightly better circulation in my practice now and as it evolves. So yeah, that's my slightly convoluted explanation for my inclusion of the Marielle Tarot. Oldie but a goodie, and continuing to do a good job. And also, the idea being to illuminate ways in which I can make sure that it continues to do a good job, because that's my job. Okay, last deck category is a deck that has caused you in some capacity, or that might cause you in some capacity, to reassess your understanding of tarot or yourself, or say a subject matter or a type of illustration and so on. Not quite the same as a deck that's caught you by surprise, especially because that seems to be quite common for a lot of, ongoing deck purchases and acquisition, but rather some deck that's in your collection that you had realized was starting to gather dust, and then at a certain point, something has caused you to realize that this can come back into circulation because there's been a reassessment in your life, a development that maybe was a little less anticipated, but is, potentially a good thing or a thing that is worth more exploration. And I think as an answer to this, it'll be an interesting choice for me. I made this bag, this cloth actually, I originally did the Kickstarter backing for the Oak, Ash, and Thorn Tarot, which is actually a deck I'm going to be giving to my sister. Kickstarter version of the deck, but this is so just in case anyone recognizes that this is the plant dyed fabric that came with the tier of backing that I did, or it came with the decks, and I felt that it matched quite nicely with its yellow insides. I did a different fabric on the inside. Matches quite nicely, visually speaking, with the vibe, as it were, of the joie de vivre. Now, the reason this is in my reassess category, my why, is that recently in one of my videos, I will try to link it above, and I will potentially put the name of the person who left this comment or something along those lines on the screen. But someone recently left a comment on one of my videos where I was talking about being stuck with my decks, or the ways in which I tend to get overwhelmed and think categorically. They basically said a really lovely and simple comment, how about joy? Just simple joy as a category. And I was really interested by that, because my initial reaction was, I don't experience uncomplicated joy. I don't know what that is. That's weird. Like my initial reaction was both true of myself, but also therefore quite willing to write off the notion that a deck can just bring you joy. And then I was thinking about that, and I was like, okay, but why not though? Like what's my issue? What the heck? Sorsha, what's that about? Now I have a good set of ideas about what that's about, but basically I think that this notion of simple joy makes this an excellent entry for reassessment. Now, this is a deck that I was in no way planning to get rid of. I just knew that it was sitting in my collection, awaiting that sort of, essentially that click. But I was getting quite complacent about not making that click occur. Really not, insisting very strongly that click should occur for me. So this notion of simple joy was really interesting to me, and that's the why that it's in this category. Now, what I can do about that. In this case, I think would be really helpful. I know there's this classic idea of using a deck for inner child work. But I think that, again, insofar as that's a way in which we integrate childhood experiences into the present, I think this deck is a great conduit for something along those lines. That if I were to approach this deck very much in terms of reaching back into childhood experiences, of which I would have experienced a lot of illustration very much like this, with these sort of slightly mean or very, very sharp, intelligent faces, while still being in a very whimsical, almost childlike or child-friendly illustration style. So I can sort of path work, as it were, into childhood experiences using this deck, but bring it into the present by reinstating, for example, a sense of simple joy in the act of creating drawings or art in response to the cards. That would be one method or technique for ensuring that this deck gets regular use, because for me, sometimes it's a bit difficult for me to just resolve to use a deck more, and I need to kind of think through how would I ensure, with some sense of regularity, but in a way that doesn't overwhelm me, how would I ensure that deck gets a bit more use? And I think in this case, there's the notion, obviously, that tarot is obviously divination, but I also think there's a notion that one can sort of explore personal visions or other forms of divination and magical creation through art. And I think it would be really interesting to combine this deck with the artistic process to kind of reinstate a bit more of that magical potency and that divinatory potency in crafting or making art, or depending on sort of how my relationship with this deck grows, even using it in some of my stitchcraft, my wicked stitchcraft or sewing magic, clothing making magic, because I think there's also a very interesting doll-like stitched quality to a lot of these characters and their sort of patchwork clothing. I have in the past written poems with this deck, but in that capacity, again, it was tending to get very, very little usage because it was kind of essentially too intense and triggering. I'm one of those people who finds light colors, happy textures, really, really sort of whimsical, easygoing things triggering, because like none of that is in alignment with what my life experience has been like, which isn't to say that I've had the most difficult life. I'm not here to complain. I just mean more that there are some of those lighter moods, vibes aesthetics that I find quite alienating, and that can be, for me, a bit of a sore spot. And I think this deck, again, in terms of actually following through with that sense of reassessment, I think this deck would be an excellent way to open that doorway and explore that world, that fragile but also intensely emotive and emotionally intelligent and strong world of childhood, and bringing that expression into my current artistic practice, and therefore also integrating that into who I am as hopefully a whole and healthy human being. So yeah, simple, easy, hopefully easy anyway, tag. I would encourage that if anyone participates, obviously let me know. I'm super excited to see if at all anyone wants to do this. Of course, there's always the chance that like literally no one will want to do this, and I'll just end up just talking to myself as usual. But whatever, that's fine. But let me know if you do it. And also I would encourage, if anyone does it, that they, have fun being specific with themselves, have fun exploring their own way of answering these questions, using their own way of talking or way of expressing themselves. Again, there's no pressure to have it be the end-all be-all list or set of answers. You can always revisit this if you like, but it's just an opportunity to pick 3 decks that you're like, hey, I haven't used these in a certain way. What are some of the ways in which I can pace my tarot consumption, without it necessarily being prescriptive on like how someone collects or how much they collect, but just hopefully is an opportunity for people to explore and appreciate whatever it is that they already have. So yeah, on that note, I will sign off, and I hope everyone's doing well and taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and yeah, I'll see you all next time. Bye.